You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 20th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
EU leaders and European military chiefs gather to discuss their next steps. Australia nudges its head of state off a banknote, and the annual World Happiness Report is released. Put the champagne on ice, Russia. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios at 16 Rue Bachemont in Paris. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Florence Kessler and Michele Barbero will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll find out why foreigners in Denmark are more cheerful than the Danish themselves. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, live from Paris. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Florence Kessler, CEO and founder of Live magazine, and by Michele Barbero, chief editor of AFP TV Live. Welcome both to our new Paris setup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It is exciting. I do recommend people visiting Paris do come down and see us. Apart from the studio, there is a cafe and a shop, and there's lots of nice stuff to buy and appropriately French pastries and other comestibles. But I'll ask you both to introduce yourselves and talk a bit about what you've been up to lately. Michele, what has mostly been taking up your time at either AFP or your side hustle at Foreign Policy?
Mm-hmm. Well, essentially at AFP, I'm the head of the, as you said, the live video department. So that's by far the most important job I have, and that takes up most of my time. And in that capacity, I deal with all the main stories that make headlines around the world, with a particular interest, of course, on French stories, French politics, but not just that. And as far as the rest is concerned, I mean, I've been keeping an eye, of course, on Macron and his big comeback from the situation he found himself in, where he seemed to be quite in a lot of trouble, and now somehow is back on the saddle thanks to this big geopolitical crisis with the US.
Well, we will be returning to the subject of President Macron shortly, but Florence, introduce to our listeners Live magazine, if you would.
I shall. So I have created 12 years ago now a media which is a bit different, because we have journalists and authors and photographers stand up in theaters and tell reported story live. And so it's as if you would go to the newsstand and buy a magazine, except you just buy a ticket to the theater and you don't know what's in it. And so it's about 10 stories, 2 hours, and we've done it in huge national theaters, antique theaters, venues around the world. And so it gives us a lot of optimism. Me and the journalist on stage, we have 600 who have participated in the 20 cities around the world.
It is nice to hear there is that kind of appetite for storytelling.
Yeah, because now we fill a gigantic venue. We recently sold for a Brussels show in June, 6 months before June, just before Christmas, almost 5,000 tickets in 2 hours. So people... So it's just like it warms our journalist heart to see that there is, and like Michele, I mean, I devour the news and I love the news, but we're not crushed under the breaking news cycle, and so we produce journalism, but maybe in the first person and with a little kind of different setup. So we compose. We have a live band. I can say I have my own rock band, which is pretty cool, I must say. And so we compose music, and so we do journalism with a lot of creativity and imagination, but we try to be very firm on fact-checking facts, and we do all that for the love of facts and to have journalism and in the limelight.
Well, we will be starting in Brussels, where EU leaders are having yet another summit concerned substantially with how to defend Ukraine specifically and Europe more generally from the predations of Russia and the indifference of the United States. It has not been a complete show of unity. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán refused to sign a statement affirming the EU's, quote, continued and unwavering commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Possibly more practically, European military leaders have been conferring in London, considering what the so-called coalition of the willing, suggested by UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, might be able to deploy in, around or over Ukraine. Michele, first of all, drawing on your expertise working for foreign policy as well, does anybody care what Hungary thinks?
Well, I think in Europe they do, because in Brussels they do realize that the fact that Europe does not present a united front in this crisis is the major issue that the EU has. And that's why essentially no one is taking the EU seriously, and with some reason. I think a lot of what's going on both in Brussels and in London right now, it can also be interpreted as a lot of thrashing in a way to in a way pretend that the UN or Europe, in a broader sense, has a say, can contribute to the resolution of this crisis, which right now is not really the case. Because it's not just Hungary or Slovakia, so admittedly pro-Russian countries within the European continent. It's a whole array of different sensibilities and attitudes to foreign policy, agendas, views of the US, and to what extent Europe should still rely on the US for its military equipment, for example. And until Europe doesn't find a way to present a more united front and to act like a single geopolitical power, it will not be taken seriously. And unfortunately, as a European, I don't believe this is happening anytime soon, right?
Florence, what has the messaging in France been like from President Macron over the last few weeks? In the United Kingdom, Sir Keir Starmer has tried, I think, to stress that things really have changed and that things are going to have to change. But the UK-US alliance is regarded as such a part of the furniture that I think people are having trouble grasping that it might not be what it has always been. Has Macron sort of communicated the idea that there has been a break between Europe and the United States?
I don't think, and tell me, Michele, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he has stated it. I think he has warned, and we were very proud that he kind of, before the terrible meeting with Zelensky, that he kind of stood up a little bit to Trump by telling him what you just said was wrong. I know it's a minuscule thing, but still, we're like, okay, at least somebody's going to put some facts in this huge but I think it's everybody is very terrified and sad, and to see this new world order. Macron, and I don't know what you both think, had already at the beginning of the war been taking that role and had gone to meet Putin in Moscow, and he failed. So there is also a bit of this déjà vu fear that maybe he's going to try and maybe to make up for the failure of the domestic public policy decision and the dissolution of the National Assembly that was such a disaster.
Well, on that thought, Michele, does he perhaps see, if he's thinking in terms of somewhat self-serving politician here, some kind of an opportunity here? He has about 2 years left. He can't run for president again. He's going to want to bequeath some sort of legacy. It's always been fairly clear that he does see the president of France as a potential alternative leader of the free world, and not without reason. Is there possibly part of him that does actually see America wandering off as kind of an opportunity for France and perhaps for himself personally?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Trump's election from Macron's standpoint is the best thing that could happen to France in a way, in the sense that Macron, as we mentioned, used to find himself for the past few months, as has been said, in a difficult position, with essentially condemned to irrelevance because of domestic politics, and therefore to irrelevance also on the international stage. Like I do get a sense, monitoring what international broadcasters, for example, cover and so on, that there's been a drop in interest in what Macron has to say on anything really over the past few months, and with reason, because he was effectively a crippled president. And now this the election of Trump in a way makes him look prescient, frankly, in the idea that Europe needs strategic autonomy from the US. It's something that Macron has been pushing, since he first became president in 2017, and this is really his way out of the corner he had found himself in. Of course, the political situation in France hasn't changed at all. He's still struggling very much to get anything done, and that's why one always needs to kind of underscore the gap between the bombastic words and what actually can be done. He delivered an address to the nation a few weeks ago, in which effectively he tried to strike Churchillian tones, where it almost sounded like we're back in 1813 with the Russian troops about to enter Paris. But then he also said, we need to invest more in defense, but I promise I'm not gonna raise any taxes, which he's literally not putting money where his mouth is, in a way. So it's hard to see how anything really substantial can get done at this rate.
Well, let's look now at some of his domestic travails in France, because yet another row is looming over pensions and retirement age. In late 2023, France nudged the age at which it starts paying a state pension up from 62 to 64, still among the lowest in the European Union. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Francois Barbero sought to head decisively off any wistful hopes of trades unions that it might be bumped back down a couple of years, not least as France, like the rest of Europe, suddenly finds itself having to adjust to the kind of unpleasant new strategic realities which will involve spending chunky sums of money on defence. Florence, is this likely to produce widespread uproar, do you think, or has everyone kind of got used to the idea that 64 is what the pension age is? I know the Prime Minister said he was open to discussing this with the trades unions, but his line now appears to be that, well, things have changed.
I don't think the pension dossier is completely closed, and the thing is, Barbero has built his coalition with the socialists, saying that he will rediscuss and renegotiate and sit at the negotiating table. So the fact that he's breaking his promise when he is already in a pretty fragile state of governing is a bit disappointing, I guess, and a bit worrisome. Pension is, as you said, and we, Michele, you, me, we have traveled the world, and we know that this is a pretty sweet deal, maybe seen from abroad. Here, and maybe we'll talk about it later, the pact, the contract, the État-providence, and the way that the public state and each individual in France, this kind of relationship that is difficult to understand when you're born in it, this kind of relationship with the government, and the fact that they have to provide to you when you're old, is a very strong, super strong feeling. And so it's very we are lucky, and I'm also American, and I've lived abroad. But we are lucky, but when you're French, this is like this kind of essence of what it is. There is no philanthropy so much here in France, because people, this whole pact of, is just very special, the way, and so it was very contentious for that reason.
I mean, all that notwithstanding, Michele, and this isn't just a French thing, although you're right, Florence, in suggesting that there is an unusual relationship, I think, between French citizens and the French state. But what would be stopping somebody in the Prime Minister's position from saying, look, the facts are these: when state pensions started being introduced in France in the early 20th century, life expectancy was under 50. It's now 82. This was the idea. The idea was never to sort of subsidize a 20-year holiday.
People don't want to hear that.
I think one of the issues here was how the reform was framed and presented to begin with. I think people can agree, globally speaking, that as a nation, I mean, most people will not agree to that. That's true. But if you reason with people, even I think there's a broad consensus on the fact that something needs to be done by and large. The thing is that the way this reform was conceived, the one variable that the government decided to intervene on was retirement age, rather than say how many years of contributions into the system does one need to have made before being allowed to retire. What's the result? That, for the people who are the best educated in France, who attended university and so on, for them, de facto, going from a retirement age of 62 to 64 doesn't change a thing, because they were already forced to wait until way past the age of 64. Whereas if you are a factory worker who started working at 18, then you qualify to retire at 62, right? And so I think the problem here, and it's a real one. It's not just a question of how things are framed. It's the usual problem of who pays for things. And I also hear those who say, yeah, sure, the pension system is not sustainable here, but it's also, at the end of the day, a political decision of whether you decide to fund some of that unsustainability, if you see what I mean, with other revenues. The first move made by Macron in 2017 was de facto scattering a wealth tax. Okay, so it's as usual a question of who pays for what, and ultimately political decisions that need to be made.
And that's exactly what you said. And there was something very unjust when you were saying the burden of this reform was going to be had by the most fragile in society, and the poorest and the less educated, as you said. And the wealth tax, and the whole thing was also presented as a way, and I completely agree that there needs to be some reform, but there was also presented as a way to save money and reduce the debt. But there was, maybe he should have also done something about, tax evasion or other things, or, there was something a bit brutal in the way it was.
There was a sense that once again the cost of this sacrifice was not being justly distributed across society. Once again, I think that's what really triggered I don't know if you recall the mass demonstrations in 2023 when people.
It's honestly hard to keep track of mass demonstrations in France.
That was one of the latest big waves, essentially.
But just finally on the Prime Minister, Florence, how is he tracking generally? Has he articulated any sort of vision he wants to make manifest, or is he one of those politicians who is doomed to spend all his waking hours just trying to keep his government together?
Barbero is not an exciting prime minister. I've known him all my life. He's been around. He was like the centrist guy. He has also a little persona. He writes book. He likes the South. He likes to eat. He's the son of a farmer. He has done very brilliant studies, but he's very Catholic. There is something a bit. He has his little persona. And we found him a bit, we thought maybe he would rise to the occasion. Finally, he's been waiting all his life to have this job of prime minister. And we were not very impressed. His acceptance of his policy speech was a bit nothing. It was, I thought he would have a little bit of flamboyance or something a little exciting. And frankly, zero. It was all all boring a bit. What did you think?
For somebody
A bit Italian, I think.
And for somebody who's been wanting to be a PM for his entire life, is there's been a few blunders, like
Major
political blunders, communication blunders, including one even recently with different ministers squabbling over yet another Veil-related route. There's one of those like every month.
He had a major crisis that he could have turned into an opportunity. Frankly, Betaham is a school where his children have been going to, and his wife was teaching Catholic studies. And there has been a massive, horrible coming out of kids who were raped and abused. It's the place to go when you are like a chic guy from the Southwest. My grandfather was there before the war. It's horrible. They were terrorizing kids on top of the rapes. He said, no, I didn't know. There was accumulating evidence that he must have. I don't know. There was something really sad and a bit disappointing, frankly, and not very caring.
Well, let's move along somewhat to the other side of the world, in fact, specifically Australia, which has always exhibited a more indulgent attitude to monarchy than France, which is to say Australia still has a monarchy, or at least borrows the United Kingdom's from time to time. It is indeed a little over a quarter of a century since Australians were offered the opportunity to become a republic by the peaceful means of a referendum, and declined. But the kind of people who care about this kind of thing have furiously denounced subversive intent in the news that when Australia's new $5 note is released, the picture of Queen Elizabeth II, which presently adorns it, will not be replaced with one of her son, Charles III, who will have to make do with jostling for space on Australia's coins with kangaroos, platypuses and echidnas. Michele, I'm sure people in the saloons, patisseries, boulangeries and cafes of Paris are talking about nothing else.
That's literally on top of the agenda of every single Frenchman in the country. No, I mean, obviously, as you suggest, no one cares about this story in France, and I don't think it's being reported virtually at all.
Well, it has now.
Yeah, it has now. From the heart of Paris.
But the reason we brought this up, and I'll put this to you, Florence, is does France still have, despite having done away with its own monarchy in spectacular fashion some while ago, is there still a fascination with other people's monarchies? Is there still any kind of interest in all the pageantry and grandeur and soap opera that goes along with it?
Frankly, I don't know. I am not very fascinated by the British monarchy or by the old French monarchy. I don't know. I was wondering, as you were asking this question, is the aristocrat class in France? I think people love to have a little particule, there is something where people know who they come from and they can with the names and some things as, he's a noblesse française, and there is a bit of that sometimes. I don't know. Do you think we're fascinated by the...
Personally, I think the French are somewhat fascinated by British royals, just like the rest of the world. Not everybody, of course. You're allowed not to be, but a lot of people are. I think just the way people are fascinated by Brad Pitt and Hollywood celebrity. I think that's the way people look at it. That's the kind of interest people have in this kind of things, which is interesting because at the same time, France is, perhaps the most Republican country I can think of. Republican in terms of like really being attached to the idea of a republic. You see that you breathe that in the streets, You're right. People love to buy. People love Lady Di. People love
but a little. The Crown. I don't know the Crown. The Netflix series must have had huge ratings here.
Yeah, but
I watched it.
But at the same time, people are also have a relationship with authority, which is which is very almost disrespectful in a way that you cannot imagine in most other Western countries, in terms of just rejecting by default what was being pushed down your throat from the government, from the authorities. So that's what I mean when I say it's a very Republican country. It's a country really attached to the idea of republic.
I did want to ask finally on this subject, one other thing that my fellow Australians have that the French don't, apart from a monarchy, is our own banknotes. And I'm just wondering, do you or indeed anybody else in France miss the old franc banknotes, which I always thought were really beautiful, both the most recent ones, the more colourful ones with Eiffel, Cézanne, the Curies, among others, but the ones before that, the 100-franc note with Eugene Delacroix and the Goddess of Liberty, they were fabulous. Does anyone miss them?
I found a bunch by cleaning my parents' house. And it was so cool to see those notes, because it was such a. But I don't think about it so often. Do you? Do you miss them?
No, I don't. And
the lira.
Yeah, exactly. Same happens in Italy. I don't know of anyone who's really spending time like thinking back to the good old times when we had the lira and not the euro, despite the massive inflation triggered by the euro.
Pitilessly.
Plus, we're becoming a bit coinless, and the cash is disappearing fast.
Yeah.
And finally, much later than England, I guess, but finally, you can pay the taxi with your phone, and they don't say, "No, I don't take it." God.
Well, we will move along now to the release of this year's iteration of the UN-sponsored World Happiness Report, which finds the happiest of the world's nations is Finland, and for the 8th year running. Finns are celebrating this accolade in the style for which they are famous. We are hearing reports that a man in Turku has enacted 2 slight, solemn, but clearly satisfied nods of his head. More pertinently to our current location, however, France is apparently noticeably grumpier than this time last year, falling 6 places from 27th to 33rd, behind Kosovo, Kuwait, Serbia and Saudi Arabia. What are you all so grumpy about?
We are the most pessimist people. We are a pessimist nation. We have actually an economist, Claudia Senik, who specialized in the economy of happiness, and she's been fantastic into thinking. But year after year, we are grumpy and unhappy.
Michele, is it a thing that what actually makes the French happy is being grumpy? Because I think, like most people,
For sure.
I think like most
exactly that.
I think like most people who visit France, every time I visit France, Paris or elsewhere, I mostly walk around thinking, this is really nice.
Absolutely.
Because it is.
The French just are very happy about being unhappy, I think. And that leads me to my next argument, which is, am I allowed to push back a little bit against the whole premise of these rankings?
Please.
I find them just ridiculous. It's very interesting. They're quite telling about the way we think as in our era. I think it's an age where we are kind of obsessed with measuring everything and also ranking everything. There's a book I read recently called The Tyranny of Metrics by an American scholar, about how essentially we've become obsessed with measuring things, and this actually ends up having an impact on policy, in the sense that the policies or the way institutions are shaped and so on ends up being done so that that looks good on based on the metrics that are being measured by, rather than the other way around. He makes the example of academia, for example, of universities, with the result that professors and teachers are completely swamped with paperwork and so on. So that this often has a negative impact on the actual programs and policies. So I think we tend to take for granted as not as Westerners at the very least in this time and era, that everything can be measured, which I already find relatively quite ridiculous when it comes to GDP. Next year's GDP, we pretend like we know the level of GDP in 12 months. And I find it even more ridiculous when we're talking about feelings and happiness. Like I was reading I think one of the criteria for this ranking about happiness is whether people eat alone or not. The US has dropped, I think, one position because, among other things, there's more people who say they eat alone. And as a loner myself, who actually enjoys eating alone and spending quite a bit of time alone, I reject this association between, being alone and being unhappy. And that's just one example. I just find it's a strange ranking from my standpoint.
Well, on that thought, Florence, and finally on this, is it possible that the compilers of this report have misapprehended what the French think of as happiness? That maybe the reality is the French are incredibly happy, it just doesn't look like what the rest of us think of as happiness? No, you're actually miserable.
The perception of life as something a bit negative here, people, and frankly, I have lived in several countries in the world. This is cool to live in France. It's not, public policy, beauty.
It's nice, as I was saying.
It's nice. I don't know Australia, but maybe
Australia is also nice.
Are you guys happy, by the way?
We are the 11th happiest people in the world.
Fabulous. Good for you guys.
According to this report. And I, for one, think that not having the king frowning at us from the $5 note might get us into the top 10 next year. On that upbeat note, Florence Kessler and Michele Barbero, thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Monocle Daily, live from Monocle's Paris studios. And finally, on today's show, and sticking with the theme of happiness, the Scandinavian country of Denmark perennially plays second fiddle to Finland in that happiness index. And as it turns out, the Danish themselves are even less cheerful than the foreigners who inhabit their country. Here is one of them, Monocle's Copenhagen correspondent, Michael Booth.
You may have heard that yesterday the Finns placed number 1 on the United Nations World Happiness Report for the 8th time in a row. Yawn. But also, come on, really? More intriguingly, the second-place Danes have been taking a closer look at their own renowned happiness. On the same day, Denmark's Realdania Foundation published a new large-scale investigation into Danish happiness based on the responses of 122,000 inhabitants. The conclusions of the report broadly support what we already know to be the key ingredients to happy societies: trust, equality, community, things at which the Danes happen to excel. The Realdania analysts somehow also managed to crunch their 1 million data points to conclude that the absolute epicenter of Danish happiness resides in the Jutland town of Knebel. Now, I once enjoyed a long weekend in a summer house near Knebel. It was perfectly nice. I'm sure it has a solid community spirit. It's probably a lovely place for retirees. But under no circumstances would I, or anyone I know, or have ever known, ever want to move there. More interesting was the revelation that foreigners living in Denmark are even happier than the Danes. Brits and Americans living in Denmark scored particularly highly for mental well-being, like feeling relaxed, finding meaning with life. They were very satisfied with overall safety, especially for kids and after dark, and they had a very high level of trust in both local and national government. Filipinos scored higher still. Thais, Vietnamese, and Germans were also abundant with Danish joy. Perhaps this shouldn't be surprising. Outsiders are obviously going to be more acutely aware of the differences in their adopted homes, for good and bad. But what has changed in terms of Denmark is the former, the good, now outweighs the latter, the bad. Go back a couple of decades to the dark times, before the new Nordic food revolution, before Danish shops opened at reasonable times, to when going out here was limited to Fridays and Saturdays, and expats in Denmark would have had a predictable list of complaints about, the Danish weather, the taxes, the dour locals, and the awful food. In 2025, if you're a foreigner who's moved to Denmark, the chances are you're wise to the benefits of wealth redistribution. You'll have noticed the winters are milder these days, the locals are more outgoing, and the food has its moments too. Meanwhile, The outside world has begun to look a whole lot less appealing. Brexit, Trump, Ukraine, Gaza, COVID. My overwhelming feeling about living in Denmark in recent years has been one of gratitude to have escaped. These days, when I meet someone who complains about life in Denmark, which is mostly Danes, I have to say, I always ask them a simple question. Well, is there anywhere else you'd rather live? And as much as I admire those redoubtable Finns, the answer is probably not Finland. For Monocle in Copenhagen, I'm Michael Booth.
Thank you, Michael. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to our panellists today, Florence Kessler and Michele Barbero. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Francesca Gilks. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in Paris. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow, also from Paris. Thanks for listening.